Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Federica, and thank Columbia for having me. This is indeed a distinguished panel. I'm going to mostly be talking about how the law should react to psychopaths. But first, I am going to say a few words about my view of how we should be thinking about the responsibility of psychopaths. I want to start, though, with a very important point, that the legal criteria for responsibility are not brain criteria, they're not nervous system criteria, they are acts and mental states. So everything we learn not only from neuroscience, but from genetics, or from any other scientific discipline that's going to bear on our attributions of responsibility and decisions about punishment have got to be translated into the law's behavioral terms. And I'm using behavior broadly to mean acts and mental states. First, let me tell you what I mean by a psychopath, which is consistent with what you've heard from Adrian Rain and Katrina Sifford. I think of psychopaths, and again, this is a continuum, but I'm going to be talking about people who have extreme amounts of what I'm talking about as people who are sort of colorblind to the moral rules. They just don't get the point of morality. That never plays a role, and Professor Sifford finished with this. They just, moral reasons don't play a role in their decision making. Now, you've heard that maybe they can train themselves perhaps to do a little bit better, but I want to assume that there are people who don't see the point of morality for some reason and can't train themselves out of it. So let's take that as one factor. And the second factor I'm going to look at is whether or not they have empathy. Whether that is, they are capable of using an understanding of how their behavior affects other people to guide their own behavior. So essentially, those are the two factors I'm going to be talking about, the kinds of people who meet them. Now, to think about what the law can do, what I have suggested in the literature is that basically if you're trying to explain how the law can deprive people of liberty, there are two basic justifications. What I call desert jurisprudence, that's basically the province of the criminal justice system, where people have committed a crime, and therefore we believe they deserve blame and punishment, and we can clutch them and do what we think is proportional to their culpability. The other way of looking at it is disease jurisprudence. By this I mean dangerous disease. There are people for whom, whether or not they have committed a crime, we think they are dangerous and not responsible for their dangerousness. If they're not responsible, we're not entitled to blame and punish them. But if they are not responsible but dangerous, we may have an alternative civil law justification for clutching them and treating them by depriving them of their liberty. The classic example to think about this, not from the realm of psychopathy or criminal law, is think about people who have contagious diseases that absolutely cannot be managed in the community. They may need to be quarantined. It's not their fault, and we're not punishing them, but we may need to quarantine them for social safety if we can't figure out a way of letting them to be safely in the community. Now, notice what happens if I'm right about disease jurisprudence, and I believe I am, just as a descriptive matter. It leaves a gap. I want you to imagine the following hypothetical. We've got an armed robber who's got 3 offenses under his belt, and of course now I'm going to make up something that would have been in a 1950s movie. He has an exit interview with the warden. And the warden says, well, young man, you've done your time, you've paid your debt to society, I want you now to go out and be a good citizen. And what our armed robber says, warden, I'm never going inside again. As soon as I get out of here, I'm going to go get me a gun, I'm going to do armed robbery, and if anyone makes me, looks at me straight in the eye such that they might be able to identify me, I'm going to blow them away. Now, there's nothing we can do. There's no criminal conviction anymore. He's done his time for that. Arguably, he's a responsible agent. He's a very dangerous responsible agent, but he's very dangerous. Nothing we can do about it. Nothing until he goes so far as to commit, let's say, an attempt. And what are we going to do? Follow him around all the time until he does? And notice, by the way, it's utterly predictable as anything you can imagine. I mean, yes, he may have a Chuck Colson conversion as he walks out the prison door, but he's going to do what he says, and so we have to let him go. Now, that's a dangerous gap. What the law is always trying to do is fill that gap. You hear on the subway, mind the gap. Or at the train station, well, people mind the gap. And the way you can do it is either to expand disease jurisprudence or to expand desert jurisprudence. An example of the latter, expanding desert jurisprudence. 3 strikes and you're out laws. Figuring out ways to keep people inside for a very, very long time in the criminal justice system. If you want an example of desert expansion, it would be the treatment of so-called mentally abnormal, sexually violent predators. These are people who, when they finish their term for which they've been properly punished for a sexual offense, they're then hospitalized on an indefinite basis because they're not responsible for their sexual conduct. Now notice what's happened. We've just punished the hell out of them because they were responsible, no defense to crime, but then we say they're not responsible, so now we get to civilly commit them. That's an expansion of disease jurisprudence. Well, how does the psychopath fare on moral responsibility in my view? I totally agree with Professor Sifford that in those cases where there is a real deficit in the ability to take moral reasons, distinctively as moral reasons, into account, these are not fully responsible agents. And if it's a severe enough deficit, they're not responsible at all. Where I think I perhaps part ways with her is when we come to legal responsibility. So, if we are going to hold psychopaths non-responsible, what's going to be the doctrinal hook? What is going to be the practical hook for doing it? Today, it's got to be the insanity defense, because there's no other doctrinal way of doing it. I have some ideas about how else we might do it, but that's what it's going to be. So, the way legal insanity works in the United States is you have to have a mental disorder, and by the way, what a mental disorder is for the legal insanity claim is not a medical or psychological or neuroscientific question. It's a legal question. We decide what counts, we the lawyers. You know, doctors can do whatever they want in their consulting room. When we're in the legislature, in the courtroom, they do it our way or else. All right, now, so is psychopathy a mental disorder? Well, this is actually very controversial. Some people say it is, and some people say it's not. As I'm sure you'll hear from our commentator, that there is major dispute about what a disease is in general in the philosophy of medicine and the philosophy of science. There are no uncontroversial criteria for what counts as a disease. These people have deficits. Are all deficits diseases? Well, these days, most of the psychopathy researchers are willing to consider it a mental disorder. The law does not, by and large. It refuses to recognize psychopathy. And by the way, psychopathy is different from antisocial personality disorder, which Professor Rain talked about, which is a disorder marked by just simply repetitive antisocial conduct for the most part. Psychopaths have these emotional and moral deficits as well. Okay, we don't allow it to be used. We'd have to switch. We'd have to make that change. Assume we made that change. Now the legislatures and the courts say, okay, psychopathy can be the predicate for a for an insanity defense. Now you have the actual excusing conditions in the insanity defense. Just being mentally ill does not make you legally insane. You either have to have, as Professor Sifford suggested, you have to have some kind of cognitive problem, or you have to have some kind of control problem. So, on the cognitive side, do you know right from wrong? Do you know the nature and quality of your act? On the control side, can you conform your conduct to the requirements of law? All right. These are not self-defining. They can be understood narrowly or they can be understood broadly. That's a moral question. So there's nothing about the insanity defense tests themselves that would give you a read-off answer of whether psychopaths should be responsible legally or not. Let me give you an example. Did Andrea Yates, the Texas mom who was psychotic and drowned her 5 kids in a bathtub to save them from being tortured in hell for all eternity because she thought she was corrupting them, did she know right from wrong? Well, did she know it was against the law of Texas to murder children? And she knew they were children, and she was killing them. Yeah. Did she know her neighbors would probably disapprove? Well, yeah. But, so, very narrowly speaking, she knew she was killing kids, she knew they were her kids, and she knew it was against the law, and she knew probably her neighbors would disapprove. But if you ask her, why did you do it? She'd say, well, if you knew what I knew, now remember, she was delusional. If you knew what I knew, that I'm saving my kids from torture for all eternity, that's a long time, in hell by Satan, you'd kill them now too to save them from that. So in a certain sense, she was saying, you know, I really did the morally right thing. Okay, should we interpret the insanity defense narrowly, or should we interpret it broadly? If we interpret it broadly, her material motivation for action to save the children from eternal torture was positive, and we should excuse her. On the other hand, if we look at it very narrowly, did she know the law of Texas? We don't excuse her. There's nothing self-defining about that. Nothing at all. And we can decide, and I would decide, and here's why I would decide, that at least the extreme psychopaths should be held legally responsible. Think about the reasons why you don't violate the law. One reason is because you understand the underlying moral reasons behind the law, why you shouldn't kill other people for fun. And you endorse those reasons, you accept those reasons. You also have the empathy that would allow you to understand how people would feel if you behaved in certain ways to them. And that's why you don't. It's not because there's a policeman on the corner. And then the law gives you also prudential reasons. You do this, we're going to punish the hell out of you. All right? What I would like to suggest is the best reasons for guiding our behavior are those moral reasons. That's what does most of the work most of the time. It's not the fear of the police officer. And if people don't have access to those reasons, in my view, they should not be held legally responsible either. Okay, so how's the law going to respond? Here's the dirty little secret about the insanity defense. If you are acquitted by reason of insanity, you don't even pass go again. You just go straight to the forensic hospital, where you can be, according to the Supreme Court of the United States, incarcerated indefinitely, meaning maybe for the rest of your life, no matter what crime you are charged with, as long as you remain mentally ill and dangerous. Notice the disease jurisprudence. I'm dangerous, and because I'm mentally ill, I'm dangerous. I'm not responsible for that danger. So you go straight to a secure hospital, which looks for all the world very much like a prison. Indeed, it is a prison. What psychopath, since we cannot cure psychopathy, we have no idea how to do it yet, what person would choose to raise the insanity defense when they know they're going to spend the rest of their life in an institution? There aren't all sorts of people, agitating on behalf of psychopaths. They're unpopular folks. The hospital isn't going to take the risk of releasing them. Why should they? Especially since we have no sensitive diagnostic marker to say they're no longer ill, and they can fake. So, psychopaths aren't going to raise the insanity defense, and you can't impose it over their objection, at least in the United States. The Brits allow the imposition of the psychopath, of insanity defense over a competent defendant's objection, not in these United States. So no psychopath is ever going to raise the insanity defense, except maybe in a capital case. This is not going to happen. Now, if someone were to raise insanity defense and succeed, notice what we're doing. When we say the person is still dangerous, we're making a prediction about what that person is going to do if released. Is this person going to be a danger if we release that person? We now use behavioral instruments. Professor Rain has suggested that maybe by adding neural variables, or perhaps genetic variables, or astrological variables, we can increase the accuracy of prediction. Now, this worries a lot of civil libertarians. Now, why does it? Because they're afraid we're going to get too accurate at doing this. Right? Minority Report. But here's the point I'd like to make about this. We already allow predictions throughout the criminal justice system to give people bail, whether they're going to put them on probation, whether they get parole. We use predictions all the time. We think it's normatively justified to use predictions. We can't run the railroad without them. What good argument can you think of when we've already decided we're going to do something because it's normatively justified for doing it worse as opposed to better? So if with neural variables or genetic variables or any other we can do better, why wouldn't we do it? Okay. How about using the criminal justice system? We don't allow the insanity defense. Here's the problem with the criminal justice system. Desert sets, or should, set a proportionate limit on how much you can be incarcerated. So I'm an armed robber. I do an armed robbery. I'm a psychopath. 10 years for prison. I got to go be let out at the end of 10 years. I'm still going to be a psychopath. I'm still going to be dangerous, but I have to be let out. So criminal terms are limited by desert. Now we can stop doing that, but then we have a very, very harsh criminal justice system, and God knows it doesn't need to be any harsher. We could try to use traditional civil commitment, where we lock people up because they're mentally ill and dangerous to self or others. The reason that's not going to work is these days the terms are very short. These are not the sorts of people that typical mental hospitals want to treat because they don't have typical mental disorders. They're very sort of antisocially, behaviorally defective. They are not out of touch with reality or the like. And again, there's no treatment. So traditional civil commitment is not going to work. How about using one of these forms of special civil commitment like the mentally abnormal, sexually violent predators? Why not say mentally abnormal, psychopathically dangerous prisoners? Or predators. At the end of their prison term, we now hospitalize them because even though we just punished the hell out of them, we now say they're non-responsibly dangerous. Well, I'm a leading critic of these laws, which the Supreme Court has approved. I think they are a civil liberties nightmare. I think they're totalitarian. I hate them. But if that's what you want to do with psychopaths, you've got a potential route. But let me tell you a story that you're not going to like if I had more time. Then finally, here's a suggestion that has been made. The United States should abandon this desert disease jurisprudence, which is supposed to be liberty and autonomy affirming. We only punish you as responsible if you are responsible. And if you are not responsible for yourself, then there's a state justification for depriving you of autonomy and liberty. That's the disease. Well, that leaves the gap, as I said. Some people have suggested we should have pure preventive detention in the United States. That is not tied to crime, although you might use crime as evidence of dangerousness, not tied to non-responsibility, just pure dangerousness prevention alone. This is, by the way, what the Norwegians do. At the end of a prison term in Norway, think of Anders Breivik, and this is my conclusion. Think of Anders Breivik, the young man, nationalist young man, who was convicted of murder because he managed to kill 77 people as a way of making a statement about Norway for Norwegians and stuff like that. Ultimately found guilty. Norway's maximum sentence for murder is 21 years, and almost no one ever gets that in Norway, but 21 years. At the end of 21 years, Anders Breivik is probably still going to be very dangerous. Norway has, at that point, a pure preventive detention system. Untied, because he's already done his time for the crime at 21 years, and untied to disease. He doesn't have to be mentally disordered, non-responsible or anything. He's just still dangerous. And here's my little lighthearted prediction. Anders Breivik is never going to see the light of day, even in very nice Norway. So the answer is there ain't a good answer, unfortunately, without deforming either the criminal justice or the civil justice system in a way that I think would make most of us in this room very unhappy. Thank you.